Alexander the Great. From birth to legend. Birth in childhood. Alexander was born in 356 BC in the city of Pella, the capital of what was then a relatively minor kingdom on the northern edge of Greece, Macedonia. His father was King Philip, a gifted military commander and politician who had already begun transforming Macedonia from a backwater region into a serious military power. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a fierce, passionate, and, according to legend, deeply mystical woman. She claimed that she had conceived her son not by Philip, but by Zeus himself, who had appeared to her in the form of a serpent. This legend followed Alexander his entire life, and he himself seems to have believed it, or at least used it as a tool of power. From childhood, Alexander was groomed for greatness. He grew up amid constant rivalry between his parents. His father wanted to see him as a warrior and statesman, while his mother instilled in him a belief in his divine origin and an extraordinary destiny. Even at a young age, the boy displayed a stubborn, ambitious character. There is a famous story about how young Alexander tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus, an animal no one at court could control because it was frightened of its own shadow. Alexander noticed this, turned the horse to face the sun, and calmly mounted it. Philip, watching this, is said to have told his son, "Seek out a kingdom worthy of you, my son. Macedonia is too small for you." Bucephalus became his war horse for decades to come and accompanied him through nearly every campaign. In 343 BC, when Alexander was 13, his father invited Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history, to the court to become his son's tutor. Alexander studied under Aristotle for several years: philosophy, medicine, literature, politics. It was Aristotle who instilled in him a love for the works of Homer. Alexander carried a personal copy of the Iliad with him for the rest of his life and considered himself a spiritual heir to Achilles. This education shaped a unique combination in him: on one hand, a ruthless military commander, and on the other, a man genuinely fascinated by culture, science, and the idea of merging the Greek and Eastern worlds. Rise to power in 336 BC, Alexander's father, Philip, was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during a wedding celebration. The circumstances of the murder are still debated by historians. Some suspect that Olympias herself may have been behind the plot, clearing the path to the throne for her son. Alexander was 20 years old when he inherited the kingdom. The first months of his reign showed exactly what kind of ruler he would be. Neighboring tribes and Greek city-states, upon hearing of Philip's death, assumed the young king would be easy prey and rose up in revolt. Alexander responded swiftly and mercilessly. He crushed the uprisings in the north, then turned his attention to Thebes, one of the largest Greek cities, which had decided to break free of Macedonian influence. In 335 BC, Alexander stormed Thebes and ordered the city razed to the ground, selling its inhabitants into slavery as a brutal lesson to the rest of Greece. After that, no one dared challenge him again. The beginning of the Eastern Campaign in 334 BC. Having secured his power over Greece, Alexander began the endeavor he seemed born for: a campaign against the Persian Empire, the largest power in the known world at the time. With an army of roughly 35,000 men, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. His first major battle took place at the Granicus River, where Alexander defeated the Persian forces, personally leading a cavalry charge, a habit that nearly cost him his life more than once throughout his campaigns. He fought in the front ranks rather than staying safely in the rear, as most commanders of the era did, which partly explains the fierce loyalty of his soldiers. In 333 BC came the Battle of Issus, where Alexander crushed the army of the Persian king Darius himself, who fled the battlefield, abandoning his own family. Alexander treated the captured wife, mother, and daughters of Darius with pointed respect, a gesture that was not simple chivalry but calculated politics, demonstrating to both Greeks and Persians that he was not a barbarian conqueror but a legitimate claimant to power. Alexander then moved along the coast, taking one city after another. The siege of Tyre proved especially difficult, a heavily fortified island city that held out for 7 months. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway across the strait to bring siege engines directly to the walls, an engineering feat that astonished his contemporaries. After the fall of Tyre, he entered Egypt, where the local population, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Egyptian priests proclaimed Alexander the son of the god Ammon, which fit perfectly with his own beliefs about his divine origin. It was then, in 331 BC, that he founded the city of Alexandria, one of dozens of cities named after him, but the one that would go on to become one of the greatest centers of science and culture in the ancient world. The fall of the Persian Empire. The decisive battle took place in 331 BC at Gaugamela, in what is now Iraq. Darius had assembled a massive army, by some estimates several times larger than Alexander's forces, including war elephants and side chariots. Nevertheless, Alexander, using unconventional tactics and once again personally leading the decisive cavalry charge, routed the Persians. Darius fled deep into the empire and was soon killed by his own subordinates. When Alexander learned of this, he staged a public execution of the assassins, presenting himself as the legitimate avenger of the Persian king rather than merely a conqueror. After Gaugamela, Alexander occupied the capitals of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. In Persepolis, according to one version of events, the royal palace was burned down during a drunken celebration, possibly as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, or possibly by accident. Either way, the symbol of Persian power was destroyed, and Alexander became the de facto ruler of what had once been the mightiest empire in the world. The Indian campaign and the limits of conquest. Alexander did not stop there. He pushed his forces further east, through the territories of modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, deep into India. In 326 BC, at the Hydaspes River, one of the toughest battles of his career took place, against King Porus, who fielded war elephants. Alexander won, but the victory came at a heavy cost, and his army, exhausted after years of relentless campaigning, began to grumble. Soldiers who had marched thousands of kilometers and hadn't seen home in years finally refused to go any further. At the Hyphasis River, the army effectively mutinied. Alexander, against his very nature, was forced to yield and turn back, the one major instance in which his will collided with that of his own troops and lost. The return march through the Jadrosian desert turned into a catastrophe. Many soldiers died of thirst and starvation, becoming one of the darkest chapters of the entire campaign. Final years and death. Upon returning to Babylon, Alexander turned his attention to organizing the administration of his enormous empire, which now stretched from Greece to India. He pursued a policy of cultural fusion, encouraging marriages between Macedonians and Persian women, marrying Persian and Bactrian princesses himself, and incorporating Persians into his administration and army. Many of his Macedonian companions resented this policy, unwilling to share power and privilege with the conquered peoples. In 323 BC, in Babylon, Alexander suddenly fell ill. According to ancient sources, he developed a severe fever, and within a matter of days lost the ability to speak, then to move at all. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, at the age of just 32. The cause of his death remains a subject of debate among historians and medical experts to this day. Theories include malaria, typhoid fever, poisoning, the lingering effects of an old wound, or the consequences of chronic heavy drinking that had weakened his body. There is also a darker detail. Some modern researchers have suggested that the symptoms described in ancient sources may correspond to a condition in which the body would have shown no outward signs of decomposition for several days, giving rise to legends that Alexander may not have actually been dead when preparations for his burial began. When his companions asked the dying king to whom he left his empire, Alexander, according to legend, gave a brief reply, "To the strongest." That answer would determine the fate of his empire. With no clear successor, it collapsed after his death into a series of wars among his generals, known as the Diadochi, eventually splitting into several major Hellenistic kingdoms. legacy. In less than 13 years of rule, Alexander built the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from the Balkans to India, and never lost a single major battle. But his significance extends far beyond military conquest. His campaigns led to an unprecedented fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures, an era historians call Hellenism. The cities he founded, most notably Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of science, philosophy, and trade for centuries afterward. Greek language and culture spread across the Middle East and Central Asia, shaping the development of entire civilizations. Alexander the Great died young, never living to see the empire he built collapse, but his image has endured for millennia, as a symbol of boundless ambition, military genius, and the price a person pays for striving to become more than merely human.